belong to Obsession Engineering. This is a KTM 1290 Super Duke and it has a broken gearbox. So my job for the next few days is to take the engine out of it, strip it down, find what's broken, replace it, put the engine back together and reinstall it. And I thought you might like to come and see how we do it. The owner reports that the bike was struggling to get into 5th and 6th gear, so he dropped the oil out of it himself and found some big chunks of metal that he believes are bits of gear. So we're fairly sure we have a major gearbox issue. So what we're going to do is take the engine out of it, strip it all to pieces and find the damage. There is an inherent gearbox oddity with these LC8 KTM engines. The input selector shaft, which you move to select the gears, is under there. On most bikes it sticks out and the gear selector goes straight on it. On these KTM engines, they've put it behind the chain run, which to me was a bit of an engineering oversight. So what you have is this bracket that sort of hooks underneath the chain and back up to the selector. And what you can get is a bit of play in the bushes and bearings and anything that rotates. And it's quite a complicated system for what should be a fairly simple sort of solution. So it's not brilliant, and I think it doesn't help the positivity of a KTM gearbox. The way I've decided to approach the job is that I'm going to drop the fluids out of it first, and then I'm going to start at the top, removing the tank and bits of bodywork, the airbox, the throttle bodies, and a lot of the electrical gubbings. And then I'm going to move on to radiator, exhaust pipes, drive chain and bits, and sort of start at the top and work my way down. Then by the time we're finished, the engine will be held only in the frame with nothing else attaching it, and we can take the bolts out and drop it onto the floor. Most of the tooling we'll need for this job is usual workshop spanners and sockets and Allen keys and that sort of thing. I have made a couple of sort of brackets that replace the footrests, because at some point we have to take the swinging arm pivot out so the rear paddock stand doesn't work. So they are needed so you can prop the bike up on a pair of axle stands. And we'll also need the big jack for supporting the engine when we're coming to load that out. Other than that, it's all fairly straightforward. I have the bike on paddock stands to begin with. The front paddock stand just adds a little bit of height to the job, so it's easier to get the engine out later. The first job is to drain all your fluids into a bucket because you don't want to pee on the floor. Then put your fuel tank somewhere safe and you can get onto your airbox and your throttle bodies. The throttle bodies are quite complicated because there's quite a lot of connections and they can be quite snug into the rubbers in the top of the motor. Then you've got to remember to undo the rest of your electrical connections for your coils, your starter motor, your earths and all that sort of malarkey. Once they're all out the way, you can get to your rubber hoses for your radiator, take the radiator off, and then you've got access to the exhaust pipe. We then need to put a load of slack in the chain so that I can get the front sprocket off, and then I can actually start thinking about putting my little rear set adapter on, and then I can put the bike on its axle stand and on a jack. So here we go, we're not far off actually taking the engine out. The throttle bodies, the wiring for them is a little bit snug in there, so that was a little bit of fun and games. But once we'd mastered getting all that out of the way, it wasn't too bad. The input shaft selector is, well, it's a terrible piece of design engineering. I'm surprised they put up with it. But that's now off. The chain I will have to unhook as we drop the engine out, because at the moment there's not enough clearance. So all I've got to do now, I've got my jack under the engine. I have jacks under the sort of footrest stands that I've made. So now I can push the swinging arm pivot out just enough so the engine will come out without the swinging arm falling out of the bike. I will then undo the big nuts that hold the engine in on both sides, and then it should lower down relatively easily. Well, that's what we hope for anyway. So here we go, slide the swinging arm pivot out just far enough, take the engine mounting bolts out and the engine just lowers down nicely on the jack. Then I'll just pop the swinging arm pivot back in so the bike doesn't fall apart on the bench. There's a big hole where there used to be an engine, which must mean the engine's somewhere else. And there it is, sat down on the floor. The awkwardness with these is because they're vertically split crankcases and the heads and barrels bolt to the case as normal, you have to take everything apart. So it's cylinder heads off, cylinders off, and then the crankcases can come apart. It is quite a long job and costs quite a lot in consumable gaskets and such like, but I would imagine that'll pale in insignificance compared to the cost of the gearbox bits. Only one way to find out, that's to take it home and put it on the bench. As you can see, the engine is on the bench. What we're going to do to begin with is pull off the water hoses, the breather pipes, a couple of engine brackets, that sort of easy stuff. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rocker covers off and I'm going to check the cam timing, check the valve clearances, and I'll do a leak down test as well. Check the general condition of the engine because it's much easier to do it now. Then we'll start by pulling the camshafts out, cylinder heads off, barrels off, and then we'll just keep taking big lumps apart until everything's laid out across the bench. So here we go on the engine stripped down. It's water pipes and engine mounting brackets off first so that they're out the way. Then it's spark plugs out and rocker covers off so I can check the valve clearances. It's always worth doing a few checks on the way down to make the job a little bit faster later. Once I'm happy that I've got the valve clearances, I'm doing a leak down test, and this tells us whether we've got any cylinder leakage, whether the piston rings or valves are leaking, but on this engine they're not. So I can take the camshafts out and look at taking the cylinder heads off. The cylinder head bolts are very, very tight, so you need a big bar. After that, it is cylinders off, and before you know it, we can start looking at taking the side covers off. The clutch side cover, I have to take the water pump and water pump drive off first, then I can take the clutch out of it, and then I can take the rest of the cover off. Behind the cover there is also the drive for the camshafts of the rear cylinder. Once I've got all that apart, it's alternator cover off. It is a little bit tight because the magnet for the alternator is quite strong, so a little bit of wiggling and eventually she pops off. Behind the cover there is also drive to the cams and the balance shaft and bits like that. There is a lot going on inside these engines. They are quite complicated, but once you get them apart, they're still quite complicated. That's day one done. I've just got a few more bits to do before I can pull the crankcases apart tomorrow, and then we can see how much damage has occurred inside. But more importantly than that, it's time for dinner, and a little bit of apple crumble for pudding. Welcome back to day 2 of KTM fun. You'll be pleased to know that last night's apple crumble was excellent. It was with a little bit of ice cream because I'd run out of custard. But back to the engine. The first thing I have to do today is to take off the primary drive gear, which is pressed onto the crank, and I need to remove the flywheel. So we're going to get the pullers on it and we're going to give it a go. May have to add a little heat, which isn't a bad thing today, because it's cold in here. Just to be really awkward, the man at KTM used to use a 33mm thread on the flywheel for the flywheel puller, and I had one of those because it's the same size as an early RSV4. But now they've changed it and now it's a 36mm thread, and I definitely didn't have one of those. Luckily, I have some excellent local motorcycle shops who have managed to lend me the correct item. In this occasion, thank you very much to Ian at Right Way Motorcycles in Lincoln. RWH also tried to help and just didn't quite have the one I needed. So there we go. We can now extract the flywheel and split the crankcases. Woohoo! Even with the correct flywheel puller, the flywheel is tight on the crankshaft. But once that's apart, I can take all the engine mounting bolts out and I can start levering the cases apart. The cases are quite snug on their dowels, but once that's apart, I can actually have a look at the gearbox, check all the bearings and see what disasters have befallen it. I have found the problem with the gearbox, and more importantly I found why it's broken. This circlip holds this gear in place, and while I was taking it off, all of these gears moved too far along the shaft this way, because this circlip just here had gone out of control and it's worn, and you can see it's got sort of teeth marks in it, and that was no longer holding its gear in place. So what was happening was, when the gears are like this, each gear runs in the middle of the next gear. That gear runs there, that to there, that to there, and so on. What's been happening is, when this gear is driving dog to dog like that, this gear, they've gone to change gear, the rider's pressed on the lever to push this gear across, but it's actually pushed this gear out the way. And when you can see here, this gear is no longer contacting this one properly, and so it'll have spun here, taken the edges off the gears, damaged the tops of these bits here, and then eventually when it has got into gear there's bits of metal everywhere and it's broken this gear off. So that would be why it didn't go into gear very well, because this circlip is not holding everything in place properly, and unfortunately that has cost quite a lot of money, because now we need to replace quite a lot of the gears because they're damaged, and a complete engine rebuild. So there you have it. The entire thing down to one circlip that probably costs about £1.50. Now that I've got everything stripped and actually found the problem, all I've got to do now is order all the parts. So I shall get the online parts catalogue out and I shall go through it, work out exactly what we need. So I shall be going to need some gears, some circlips, that sort of thing. But we also need, of course, all of the gaskets and bits to put the engine back together. So it does get quite expensive. Then, of course, we'll just rebuild the engine, a mere few hours work, and pop the engine back in the bike, and before you know it, it'll be ready to go again. Hopefully. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time when I rebuild the KTM engine.